good, everybody? We are back with Brockhampton's new album, Iridescence. As we all know, Ameer Vann left the group, was kicked out of the group over some allegations. And so obviously we can expect that decision by Brockhampton to affect the group in some way. This album is the first and the start of a new trilogy for the group, the best times of our lives, something like that. So without further ado, let's get into it. Iridescence starts off with a lot of energy on the track New Orleans. The distorted and punchy bass complements the aggressive energy by the members, and the constant synth and backup electronic effects give the track a very kind of measured, futuristic vibe. I think Matt Champion does a very good job on his verse, and personally I think Joba and Merlin add a lot of great energy to the song, even though I do think that Joba's verse goes a little bit over the top with the amount of inflections in it. Oddly enough, Jaden Smith is featured on this track, and I was hoping that Jaden Smith would kind of bring his own style onto this track and add some of that rebellious energy, but instead it honestly just feels like he's a bland substitute for Kevin Abstract. Honestly, you could listen to this song and not even really realize that Jaden Smith is on this track. I think New Orleans is a good starting point for the group, especially if you have listened to the Saturation series albums. This is going to sound very familiar to you, but the group sounds very disjointed on this song. It just sounds like it's kind of a beat that they're all riding on. There's not really a point to this song, besides serving as a kind of energetic introduction to the rest of the album. New Orleans transitions very smoothly into Thug Life, with the drums staying mostly the same, but also finding a complete shift in the tone and attitude, from the blaring, in-your-face bass and inflections of New Orleans to a sweeter and more reflective piano instrumental. Bareface, like in most cases, does a great job singing on this track, and I do kind of like the contrast between these two songs and what they're speaking on. From what I understand, it's almost like New Orleans is the trying to act hard face that people put on and trying to provide that front to the world, whereas on Thug Life, on the inside you have demons, or you might be depressed and feel a lot of pressure. And if that is what they're speaking about, then I do enjoy the transition from New Orleans to Thug Life a little bit more. It almost sets up that front to feel a lot more temporary, like we're switching between the two almost to the same drum beat of life, I guess you could say. I think Dom has some great lyrics on this track, even though I do think the mixing is a little bit off and like lo-fi, which being lo-fi, that's perfectly fine, but it just seems a little bit off to me. Anyway, I kind of see these songs as going hand in hand, and they start off the album decently well. Berlin follows in the footsteps of both New Orleans and Thug Life, with its distorted and kind of short-lived bass that sees a winding synth section in the second half of the song that is a direct contrast to the first half of the song. And on the second half, Dom speaks about the negative attention that the group has been getting, or the backlash I should say, and pushing past that in a kind of sincere but also roundabout sort of way. To be quite honest, I'm not really sure what the message of this song is, if there is any. Now this might seem like a reach, but it might be that you shouldn't pledge your allegiance to specific colors, and instead go through life creating your own mark on society, creating your own colors, if that makes any sense. I mean, that sounds fucking retarded. I don't know, Berlin is a pretty progressive area. They've also had their fair share of issues pledging allegiance to the wrong kinds of things. I think Joba's verse at the end here, which serves at the outro, is pretty great, and is a fun way to kind of send off the track with the wild and abrasive synth and bass section. Something About Him is cool as a track, I guess. I like the soft and almost ambiguous in gender vocal effects that Kevin Abstract uses as he talks about his boyfriend, Jaden Walker. I guess it's a more accessible way of creating a song like this as a man in hip-hop. I also like that he talks about Jaden in an ethereal way. Like, you can't really put a finger on what it is exactly that he likes about him, but he just knows that it's there. It just sounds a lot more sincere than maybe some other love tracks might sound. But it's just kind of here. It's not that long. It's kind of just a throwaway track on the album. Where the Cash At, again, is a very stark contrast to Something About Him. I think Merlin does a really great job on the energy when it comes to the chorus. The instrumental is just so dark, industrial, and barren. I think the vibrating bass is cool as hell, and really doing most of the work to supply that threatening feeling to the chorus. I think if this track changed up a little bit, or even was longer, it would have had more of a lasting impact on me. I really do like the idea. I love the instrumental on this track, but I think it just could have been fleshed out a little bit further. This track is just super short. Now we get to Wait, and I think this track is a really good sonic shift from the first third of this album. The instrumental is honestly great, and it never really gets stale. Starting off with a heavenly string section that quickly breaks off into an energetic scratch breakdown, followed by a great verse from Joba, whose singing really fits this track well. I think the composition on this track is honestly A1. I really enjoy Joba's ending verse on this track with his panning vocals, and I also enjoy the childish vocal elements that are kind of falling through the production, which I think are a really great way to accentuate the nostalgic feeling of this track. The verses from both Dom and Kevin are both vulnerable and well constructed. For a song that's over 4 minutes, it honestly flies by. I think this will definitely be a longer lasting track in terms of the span of their careers for the group. District is another track that shines on this album. At the start, it sets up the juxtaposition between being comfortable with fame and having money, and more internal struggles with the change in the instrumental. Distortion isn't anything new to the group, and it's thrown on this track also, and honestly at this point it's becoming a little bit overused. And not overused as in they can't use distortion, it's just been used in a very similar way on all these tracks. Regardless, it is in good measure because the instrumental does switch up in the end, and I really love the instrumental switch up there, with its lonely guitar section, police lights, and general noisiness, which makes you feel like you're at the area, the home, that Kevin Abstract and Bareface are talking about on the outro. They did a really great job translating into music that fleeting perspective that they're trying to get across here. It's a great dichotomy between being able to have those things that you can get with money, and those things you can never have again despite how much money you end up making. Next, we get a small interview sample between DJ Who Kid and Cameron, who both kind of relate to each other, talking about how they feel they've been abused a little bit by the system and the people around them when they were just first coming up just because they wanted to release their music. Tape kind of speaks to that with the members, rapping about some of the sacrifices that they've made and how the industry has molded them and influenced the decisions and perspectives that they hold. I do think that everyone honestly does a great job, especially Kevin, on the bridge as he emulates himself as a younger version. I think where he kind of talks about his false aspirations as an artist. I think Dom's delivery towards the end is a little bit off, but overall it's a solid, vulnerable track that shows off some great storytelling. The drums on this track are really aggressive and fast-paced, and I think that's done to accentuate that quality in the story of their lives being aggressive and fast-paced with what they're doing. I think that Joba and Dom's verses could have been mixed a little bit deeper into the production for a removed feel to really complement the drums, or if their voices progressively went from being mixed deeper to more upfront in the production, maybe to fill that moody and dark atmosphere. I'm not sure how to pronounce this. Javert. I don't know. Yvert has one of the filthiest beats on this record, with some crazy electrified synth additions, constant grimy bass, and industrial whirring. The beat switch on the second half of the song is also solid, although I do think the industrial kind of whirring going on is a little bit overbearing, especially in contrast to Merlin's verse. Joba freaks out a bit on this track, which seems very genuine, but structurally I don't think really fits the song all that well. Bareface's bridge at this point is also a little bit overplayed to me. It doesn't really distinguish itself in any sort of way from the rest of his parts on this album up to this point. I think Joba's chorus on here is really well done though, with that low-key, better than you attitude coming through nicely, which I think matches Matt's verse in the beginning of the track real well. Honey and Vivid are two songs on this album that I really don't care for too much. The beat on Honey is pretty simple but effective and definitely something you could bob your head to. The only member that I think brings some real fun energy to this track is Dom, who has a great flow and something meaningful to say when it comes to him talking about discrimination pretty upfrontly. The Beyonce sample also doesn't really do much, as it's kind of cluttered into a stew of synths and vocal effects. And I know this is the point of the song, but it's literally just kind of there to be like, we're rich and we can sample Beyonce saying yes on a track, I guess. Sure, it doesn't sound horrible, especially after the screwed and chopped sample from Brockhampton's Bump appearing later on in this track. Vivid just sounds a little bit old, with the instrumental kind of following suit with half of the other tracks off this album. Don't get me wrong, it's definitely filthy and better than a lot of artists' beats, but its scheme with distorted bass and its bright and electronic synth effects is just kind of reused at this point. And I think the same goes for Bareface's verse. I think Dom and Matt work really well together on this track, but the chorus isn't really all too memorable either, as it just kind of follows the squeaky electronic effects that are going around in the production. And as much as I just talked shit about this instrumental being overused, I do think it's like a better version of the same kind of stuff going on. It's just super filthy. I want to download like just the instrumental version of this track so bad, because that pulsating bass is just fucking crazy. If the other tracks on this album as a sum showed a less than stellar amount of versatility for the group, then I think San Marcos is a great step forward. The instrumental's very anachronistic guitar section sounds almost like something the band Brand New might put out. Bareface does a stellar job on his short but sweet chorus. The only real issues I have with this track are the weird instances of autotune on the vocals. Kevin's bridge is tolerable, but I don't know why Dom and Joba opted to use such an awkward amount of autotune on such a simple and direct song. There's a choir section at the end of this track. Why deviate from that natural sounding voice to accompany these acoustic guitars when that would have sounded so much better with the natural intonation of the choir? Some of the lyrics also just make this track sound a little bit more awkward than it should be, especially the ones on Dom's verse, like the lyric, "They tried to blackball me, but I held my avocados." Like, not to be a complete dick, but what in the shit is that? Now, Tonya came out a little bit ago as a single to this album, so I won't cover it as much as the other tracks, but overall, I think it's a pretty good track. There are a comfortable amount of instrumental switch-ups, although I do think that the first half of this song was a little bit more memorable for me and deserved a little bit more attention. What I do like about this track is that it seems very fitting for each member, with all of them kind of getting their own instrumental area to play around in, and each of them having their own thing to say and having it be pretty meaningful. Fabric is the last track on here, and it serves almost as a cliffhanger more than an outro track, and that's pretty apparent by the way the beat builds almost the whole time but never releases that pent-up energy. Merlin does a fantastic job on this track, even though I do wish that it kind of busted out into some disgusting old school West Coast hip-hop beat with that sharp bouncy synth, or it could be a guitar, I'm not really sure which one it is. Could be something completely different, who knows? The members kind of talk about the ways they've changed and feel dealing with that change. Dom's verse is the only one that's kind of weird on here, I think. And honestly, it just sounds like some shit Kanye would have said in an interview or something. It's an okay closer, with the outro alluding to the setup of this trilogy, the best years of our lives, in which this album is the first. Coming out of the Saturation trilogy, I expected the group to have a little bit more versatility when it came to the verse structure and composition of the album, and we get some of that while also not pushing the limits too far. The first third of this album seems very part and parcel for how a Brockhampton album has been structured so far, and sounds in general, whereas starting with Wait and District, we see some real musical experimentation. Ameer's exit from the group is really felt on this album, as the most memorable members for me off of this album were Joba, Dom, and Merlin. This album also seems way more serious and less goofy than the Saturation series before it, due also to the same reason, Ameer leaving the group, and it seems like the band is kind of coping with that on a few of these tracks, getting a lot of that emotional energy out in response to that. There are some parts on here where the members don't really seem like they're really working together in any distinct way, and then there are other parts where they all seem to be on the same page. Overall, it's definitely not a bad album, but there are a few issues, and so I'm gonna give this album a 7 out of 10. Let me know what you guys think. Did you like this album? Who do you think is the standout member from this album? Was it Joba? I think it was Joba. Anyway, I hope all of you have a fantastic day. Until next time, peace.